Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Rosalind Byrne, Director of the Online Ethics Center, the OEC. Thank you for being with us today, and welcome to the Online Ethics Center's spring webinar series, Bringing Ethics to the Conversation. Today, we have with us Jonathan Beever and Ali Kerr, who are the subject of ethics across the curriculum, ethics in the disciplines, and cultivating ethics literacy. Jonathan Beever is Assistant Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture in the Department of Philosophy and the Multidisciplinary Text and Technology PhD program at the University of Central Florida. He is founding director of the UCF Center for Ethics and directs a graduate certificate program in theoretical and applied ethics. Jonathan's research specializes in interdisciplinary work at the intersections of environmental ethics and bioethics, emphasizing how technologies shape relationships. He is the editor of Philosophy, Film, and the Dark Side of Interdependence, co-author of Understanding Digital Ethics, and co-editor of The Way of Nature and the Way of Grace, Philosophical Footholds on Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life, and Perspectives in Bioethics, Science, and Public Policy. He has published numerous articles and book chapters on a wide range of issues in ethics, and Jonathan serves nationally as a member of our editorial board on the Online Ethics Center and the Ethics Committee for the American Society of Engineering Education, and secretary for the International Association of Environmental Philosophy, and as an editorial advisory board member on the Journal of Philosophy and Medicine. Welcome, Jonathan, as our guest speaker today. Also with us today, we have Ali Kerr, who is a senior researcher of leadership and executive development at the National Center for Professional and Research Ethics and CPRE at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Kerr Ali completed her PhD in industrial organizational psychology at the University of Tulsa, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She has also an MA degree in industrial organizational psychology from the University of Tulsa, and a BA from the University of Southern California in LA. Her dissertation research was a comprehensive evaluation of a professional ethics training program which utilizes expert witness role-playing for engineering education. Her research interests include training development and evaluation as explored across a variety of academic disciplines and organizational settings. Her most recent projects have focused on developing engineering and science students' relevant non-technical professional skills, including leadership, creativity, and ethical practice and presentation. And I am actually at this point going to turn it over to Ali. Thank you.
Thank you, Roz. Yes, so today's presentation, thank you all for being here. We have more than 100 people registered, so we do have some joining us live on YouTube, and I'll try to get into the chat to see if I can pull that up as well. But today's discussion is meant to be interactive, so Jonathan will walk us through some of the new ideas, the way he's thinking about things, and wants this to be something that you can lend your expertise and insights and thoughts to as well. So I'll be monitoring both the chat, where I encourage you to add thoughts, discussion, interesting tidbits that you're thinking as you're going through this, and then also the Q&A section, where I will be trying to gather more of your formal questions or things you'd like to be talking about. I may not ask them directly as you present them, but I'll line them up within his outline of the way we're going to be talking about this. So the first thing I ask is that you go ahead and put what your interests are that are bringing you here today. Are you an engineering ethics educator, researcher? Are you knowledgeable about writing across the curriculum, writing studies? Are you thinking about ethical literacy yourself? What expertise and experiences are bringing you to this discussion? Somebody's already got all of the above, so welcome. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan. Go ahead and be populating the chat.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Roz. I'm really grateful for everybody's being here. And I want to start just by saying how thankful I am to the OEC and to Roz and Courtney Lazor for organizing and to Ali, Dr. Kerr, for moderating and for thinking with me. Conversations like these, the one that I want to have with you this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are, form in communities. So I'm really grateful for all the thinking with that happens in this group, especially. What I want to do today is make a distinction for you between EAC and EID, ethics across the curriculum and ethics in the disciplines, which is, I want to draw some parallels to the similar distinction, a parallel distinction, an older distinction made in writing or composition studies. So I want to think about that distinction, its implications for our work in ethics education generally. And this is a new project for me, or at least a new problem for me. So I'm really interested in thinking with you all, and I'm grateful for Ali for sort of helping me keep an eye on both the question Q&A portal and the chat. The last thing to say is that I will add references, just a short list of references of papers I cite in the chat window towards the end of this presentation for those who want to follow up with the things I'm talking about. So this distinction, EAC, ethics across the curriculum, and EID, ethics in the disciplines. In a recent paper that I published with some colleagues here at our institution looking at where ethics is taught across the University of Central Florida, we made this distinction and argued that EID approaches, or ethics in the disciplines approaches, emphasize teach the teachers peer education, with ethics specialists in one discipline helping non-specialists in another reach a level of comfort with teaching ethics within their own classes, labs, or programs. And we differentiated that rough definition of EID from a definition of EAC, or ethics across the curriculum. In that same paper, we argued that EAC approaches offer a complementary approach, emphasizing a well-researched strength in the dispersal of ethics education across a discipline's curricular plan. And I'll give you the link to that paper for those who want to follow up in a little bit. But to me, when I was thinking about this for this particular project, the distinction between EAC and EID, again, ethics across the curriculum and ethics in the disciplines, differentiates depth from scale, with across the curriculum approaches focusing on scaling up to the extent to which ethics is dispersed across a discipline's curricular plan, for instance. And while in EID, again, in the disciplines, approaches focusing on sort of expert-led depth on the subject. Now, I'm not tied, and the first thing I should say is I'm not tied to either one of those definitions. They're pretty rough and ready. But I think that distinction between across the curriculum and in the disciplines approaches can be really helpful in our work in ethics education. I've spent quite a bit of time now thinking about the ways in which ethics is diverse in really encouraging and beautiful ways, but also in really challenging ways. And so I've been more and more interested in what it would look like to build a sort of consensus or community-based model to think about a platform, like a disciplinary platform for ethics at a national level, norms that could be shared, approaches that could be shared, standards that would lead to sort of administrative take-up and support at our institutions. And I've been thinking about this a lot across my career so far as a graduate student, as a postdoc, and now as a professor here in Central Florida. So I wanted to share with you just the brief story of our Center for Ethics, which launched not very long ago in early 2019. And in that short lifespan, we've done all of the things that I think many members of this community have paved the way for us to do, including faculty workshops in ethics, graduate student workshops in ethics, courses. Of course, I'm a philosopher by training, so I teach ethics courses, invited lectures, discussion groups, ethics bowl participation, IRB work, ABET accreditation support, task forces, trainings, content creation. I feel like sometimes I'm kind of an ethics help desk for colleagues and students, undergraduate research support, community engagement, and I'm sure we could all go on as a community. And this is really not my story, right? This is the story of ethics, I think, at our institutions. It's kind of, for many of us, I feel like it's a grab bag of services with what feels to me, at least, like very little centralized support or direction. And maybe that's okay, the beautiful side of the diversity. But maybe if we can make some more careful distinctions, like the one I want to make for you this morning, or this afternoon, wherever you are, maybe we can sort of refine that approach a little bit more. So why do I think this problem between EAC and EID is important? Well, again, I think making more careful distinctions in the sort of work we do, distinctions that can be shared across projects, across disciplines, and across institutions, can help us refine a more coherent approach for what we're doing when we're thinking about ethics education. I come to ethics education from the perspective of ethics literacy, thanks to my postdoc mentor, Nancy Tuana at Penn State. And her approach to thinking about ethics as a form of literacy was really compelling to me. It's the idea that through practice and habituation and the development of relevant expertise and skill sets, we can do ethics better, right? We can make ethical decisions more regularly and in a more reasoned, structured way. And yet the literacy model also opens up the door for the complexity of ethics, the multifacetedness, the grayness, the softness of as some of my STEM colleagues might call it. This idea of ethics literacy suggests to us or reminds us that when we're thinking about ethics education, we're thinking about functionally 3 different overlapping spheres or areas of concern. And that is, those are, at least on Tuana's approach, an ethics or a moral sensitivity, our identification of when values are at stake, the ethical intensity of issues, all those sorts of questions, the sensitivity piece. The reasoning piece, so ethics reasoning, that's the normative decision-making strategies, ethical theory, the sort of reasoning bits are in the middle, and then motivation on the end. How do we move from what we feel about ethics to what we think about ethics to how we do ethics? That 3-part model, sensitivity, reasoning, and motivation, is wickedly complex. For those of us who know this literature well, right? Around ethics sensitivity, there's a growing and robustly empirical data set of moral psychology that's informing the ways in which our reasoned decision makings are limited or constrained or sometimes emboldened by our relations and our psychology, basically. The reasoning bit, philosophers have been trained in well for a long time. We've got thousands of years of history of ethical theory, structures for reasoning, ethical reasoning, structures about views of the world, ontologies that give us structures of reasoning. And then that is linked to this 3rd question: how do we move from that thinking model to the doing model? How are we motivated to act on our decisions? And that complexity, I think, is a challenge, of course, for ethics, and which is partly why we have such diversity in our approaches to it and our thinking about ethics education. And yet that's coupled to also the essentialness of ethics education. The work we do in this community and others suggests, reiterates, reaffirms the idea that making good decisions is really essential, not only to the work I do as a philosopher, but to the work all of my peers do across our disciplines. And this isn't even anymore, not that I don't think it ever was, but this isn't an academic question, right? These are now popular concerns about the way that ethical decision-making works or doesn't work around, say, our emerging technologies, our digital lives, our social connections, our environmental relations. And ethical decision-making is really essential for the work we do. And again, I'm saying this to this community, and I imagine many of you are nodding along with me or wanting to add in more detail, because I think in some ways we're in agreement about the importance of ethics. But there are all these questions. Who should teach ethics? Where should it be taught? What bodies of knowledge or communities of practice guide answers to those questions? What administrative structures are in place to research and apply the answers that we provide? And I want to pause here and just say, like, there's a chance you're thinking a couple of things. You're either thinking, wow, this is great, you're right on. More likely you're thinking, perhaps Jonathan's making a mountain out of a molehill here. Maybe there's not really that big of a problem, and making a distinction like the one I want to make between EAC and EID isn't actually going to do anything for problems of coherence or consistency in ethics education. Or worse yet, you'd think I'm setting up a straw person that's going to be too easily knocked down. I'm setting up a problem that's not really a problem at all. And if you think any of that range of things, I would really value your thoughts. Again, I see the distinction I want to make with us this afternoon as sort of an entry point into a larger conversation about these issues of coherence and clarity in ethics education. So I want to pause there and pick up a few questions here and see where we stand.
Yeah, interjecting as you're discussing, I think there's a couple of questions we have here. So the first one is just, what have been your own experiences with this distinction between and the overlap in the across the curriculum, within the discipline, the who, where, how of approaching both ethics education, or to the audience's purposes, if it's not just ethics, if there's something else you're working with this same distinction. What have been your experiences with this? Feel free to put that in the chat. We have a couple of questions coming in too.
Yeah, just to stick with the first one, Ali. Thanks for the good question. Again, I came to worrying about this problem. Again, maybe I'm making too much of it, maybe I'm not. But I came to worry about the problem because for pretty practical reasons. And I'm imagining a lot of us have had these, a lot of you have had these same experiences. But I'm regularly asked to do one of two things. Either come in as an expert on a grant project or in a classroom as an ethics expert to sort of give knowledge, right? To transfer knowledge about ethics to students or to faculty colleagues or to research groups or whatever. That's one thing. And then the second thing I'm asked to do is often train the trainers or teach the teachers, sort of come in and help other people learn how to better integrate ethics into their own thinking and work. And at the same time that sorry, Ali, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think this is really relevant to the question in the Q&A around asking who should be teaching ethics. And as you teach applied ethics to STEM students or other domains, do you feel recognized by your peers in different areas of expertise? So we have quite a few attendees that look like they're in interdisciplinary fields and they're brought here by different means than simply engineering education. And so this question is related to how do we address who should teach it even?
Yeah, yes, that's a great question. Yes, this is one of the things that I think this distinction can help us better understand. But just from my own perspective, my own experience, again, to the anonymous attendees question, which I think is a really important one. At the start of my career, I did worry a lot about this. To what extent, the less time I spent in philosophy and in philosophical communities in a traditional or professional sense, in what way was I losing my professional identity as a philosopher and gaining some new identity as an applied ethicist? I quickly came to realize that that wasn't a concern, and I'd been set up to have that concern by mainstream philosophy functionally. And again, I think that's a completely fair concern, but I guess in my own thinking and my own experience, the skills that I brought to the table as a philosopher, as an ethics expert from the sort of normative theory side, history of philosophy, history of ideas, really brings a lot to the table that's missing from an ethics in the discipline approach when, say, the chemist or the engineer or the mathematician or the psychologist is teaching ethics in their classes. They're understanding ethics, the term or the concept of ethics, in a different way than I was trained to understand it. And really, it's only through that conversation between me, the philosopher, and them, the chemist, engineer, mathematician, psychologist, that we really start to understand what ethics is in a sense that matters in these cross-disciplinary spaces. I bring a skill set that they're going to need. They bring the disciplinary expertise that's needed. And again, this was one of the things that drove my conversation here, is that most of the work I do at this point, I think, is interdisciplinary. And I would wager most of the work that many of us do at this point is interdisciplinary. So these conversations, I think, can extend beyond ethics significantly, but also more broadly about the place of expertise. So I'm not worried, I think, about losing my identity as a philosopher. I think because of my training and the research I do in the communities with which I engage, I feel just as much of a philosopher as anybody else. Yeah.
I think that does bring in that idea, though, that even when we're questioning the distinction and overlap between in the discipline and across the discipline, we're bringing in interdisciplinary teachers at that point too, and or not specific to the particular course that it's being implemented in, or maybe not focusing on the specific needs, so contextualizing it. I do want to move a little to another question as we as we keep the discussion going, which is simply what Jonathan mentioned, this ethics literacy framework, and discuss some of the different nuances and challenges within this framework. So what are your thoughts around that? What are some of the relevant things that you're questioning or working with in your own practice, your own teaching, your own research, and other relevant things? And there are a couple of questions and topics discussing, so we will be moving on to these. I haven't lost you, they're just coming up. So for now, let's be answering, is there anything specific around ethics, literacy, or other educational objectives that you think are challenged or supported or questioned with relation to the ethics across the curriculum and ethics in the discipline distinctions?
Yeah, so the intersection for me between the literacy model and the EIC-EID distinction is come together, I guess, intersect at this place of practice. A lot of the work I do with my, say, undergraduate students especially, is cultivating the practice of ethics sensitivity. So how do we identify ethical issues? How do we evaluate their intensity, how much they matter to us in a particular moment? How do we identify what values are at stake and when? That regularly takes a priority for me over how well they know Kant's distinctions about deontological ethics, for instance, right? I think that's important, especially in a disciplinary sense in philosophy. But the idea that we're cultivating a practice, a habit of asking the right questions and in the right way, thinking about them in terms of the value debates or value conflicts, is a really important part of the work. And I think there's a place where an ethics across the curriculum approach, now again, I'm making distinctions that I think are fuzzy, and I'm seeing this in some of the comments. Raghu, especially, you're sort of offering a couple of distinctions that I think are helpful here, but at least one way of looking at it is an ethics across the curriculum approach would push for, say, I'll stick with my engineering colleagues, for engineers to offer ethics in their courses regularly, right? So it shows up. And I think that can be really important if there's that, so because of the practice bit, right? But only if it's coupled with the relevant expertise. So the practice on the right thing is what cultivates literacy. Now, this is true, I think, of literacy models generally, that practice is important, but practice on the right target is really the goal of literacy development. So I think the combination for me, looking at distinguishing EAC from EID through the lens of expertise, I think is another really interesting way of seeing what's happening in ethics and making some distinctions.
Looks like some of the other questions and topics coming in are too around examining macro issues. And then I would assume that the other side of that would be consideration for micro, and maybe that those distinctions lending themselves to different approaches as well. We also have some topics around teaching following codes and how that is integrated into those different ways, especially thinking of that more as in the discipline code related than across the curriculum.
Yeah.
And then, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think I really appreciate the breadth of comments here, because we're sort of pulling at the nuance of what these concepts can do for us. So if we think about an ethics in the discipline approach as focusing on the micro, if by micro we mean, say, disciplinary codes of ethics or particular contextual issues, or responsible conduct in specific disciplines, those sorts of local specialized issues, then I think there's another space where that combination of disciplinary expertise and ethics expertise is so essential. So another place for interdisciplinary collaboration, perhaps. Ethics across the curriculum would suggest that model extend across a whole curricular plan, not just in one course. So there's a second question: what do you do with the macro issues on top of that? And this is a second ongoing tension in ethics education, of course. It's been around for a long time now, and that is, you've got these broader concerns about safety of the public or environmental concern or broader impacts, so to speak, that are put up against because of curricular time and space issues put up against the micro issues. And so there's always sort of a weighing of what's most important in any particular context. And again, if the EID approach gives us that importance of expertise, and the EAC gives us space to do that thinking across our curriculum, then I think we can have a strategy by which to resolve some of those micro tensions we see in curriculum.
Yeah, so I think that really does set us up for the next part of the discussion. Somebody even put in the chat around the library world who's focused on some of these, and we're talking about now what's our strategy? How do we approach it? So I will turn that over to you, Jonathan. I hope that's enough of a setup for topic number 2.
Yeah, no, that's great. So just so you all know, Ali and I had a plan. I shared sort of an outline of things we might talk through, and we were hoping to connect those. So I'm really grateful to you all for leading us through that so nicely. Yeah, so the question is, so what, right? So what does the distinction do in the world? And I just want to give you a couple of examples, I think, that might help us frame and circle back to some of the other questions. Ethics across the curriculum is a phrase that I think many of us have known or heard for a long time now. So this is a concept or an approach to ethics that's gotten some traction nationally. So Nancy Matchett in 2008 has this article, a book chapter called Ethics Across the Curriculum, and distinguishes there that, or makes the claim there in 2008 that most or all colleges teach ethics across their curriculum, yet relatively few institutions do it deliberately. And I think that's a really important point. The idea is that ethics is regularly left implicit in our curricular structures. That is, in almost every discipline, we talk about disciplinary values to some level in some way, right? We orient our students to the discipline through the values that shape that discipline, that make it a community. Now, to make that explicit is the role of ethics education, as I understand it. And so Matchett makes this point, right? While most colleges have this implicit in the curriculum, few make it explicit. And so Matchett calls, in that 2008 article, just to remind you of the date, calls for 3 deliberate outcomes that we might take as communities to build up what she's identifying as an ethics across the curriculum approach. The first is all students need early and often conceptual tools. So she suggests like a required core course in ethics, or I think she offers the suggestion of orientation week programming in ethics. And I'm sure we can extend that to web and online options, modular options for ethics training and education, plus changes to how faculty teach. So the support in integrating ethics into their own curricular plans. That's part 1. There's 3 of these, remember. The second one is widespread workshops for faculties and students. And she says those should be incentivized to show the importance and the institutional support for ethics. And then the third piece of these 3 are to back this all up institutionally. So make it possible, institutionalize the process and the practice of sort of critiquing existing policies and practice from an ethics perspective. And she says, if we do that, if we follow those 3 deliberate outcomes, she calls them, we'll cultivate this ethics across the curriculum. So if you think about Matchett's model here, again, 2008, and once again, I will give you this citation towards the end of the workshop this afternoon. Matchett's 3 outcomes are really institutional focused. They're not really disciplinary or even curricular focused. They come from the curriculum, what I might call a bottom-up approach to thinking about ethics, but they embody the whole, or they take into account the entire institution, and they really need the entire institution to focus. And it's a really big ask, right? So not only required courses, which many of our institutions struggle to do because of any number of things, but course requirements, curricular density, state and local requirements, any of those things, plus faculty workshops, which require faculty time, plus institutional support for a sort of faculty-led critique of policies and procedures, which itself is hard to come by. So that approach is really big. It feels to me like an ideal model of ethics across the curriculum. Just one other example from the literature. So Elaine Engelhardt and Michael Pritchard offer in their introduction to their book, Ethics Across the Curriculum, sort of what they call 2 fundamental perspectives, that ethics across the curriculum can be viewed from within individual disciplines. So say engineering programs should be expected to ensure that their students are introduced to the ethical dimensions of engineering, for instance. So within the discipline approaches. And then cutting across a curriculum or even all of a curriculum. Maybe their claim is that many ethical issues require us to think across curricular plans, across disciplinary boundaries, so to speak. And that approach then is focused on the curriculum, but it's both across the curriculum and within the curriculum. So even this approach that Engelhardt and Pritchard are making is, in my head at least, both an EAC and an EID approach. And again, the question I'm posing in this workshop with you this morning is really what's the benefit, potential or hypothetical, for drawing apart that distinction and clarifying an ethics across the curriculum approach from an ethics in the discipline approach. And then administratively, or in the ethics community, we've got SEAC, the Society for Ethics Across the Curriculum, which was established in 1992 with a goal of sort of stimulating research on ethics inside curriculum and outside. And the SEAC, the Society for Ethics Across the Curriculum, has this view that ethics should take place basically in every discipline. So we've got that phrase, ethics across the curriculum, showing up in our literatures and in our communities of practice, but again, not distinguished from this ethics in the discipline approach, or really even particularly well defined, right? There's still a lot of ambiguity and variance across the way that concept is used. And several institutional centers, mine as well, but I could call out maybe the Kegley Institute out in California and the Rock Ethics Institute, where I did my postdoctoral training. They have their own models of either teach the teachers programs or ethics bowls or faculty development or any subset of these things that all try to encourage ethics broadly across an institution, we might say, or an ethics across the curriculum program. And from these three examples, before we get back to the questions, just to summarize, from these real world examples and the literature examples, there's sort of like three big takeaways for me. One is that expertise really matters, right? There's got to be some space in this approach in ethics education for the ethics expert. Now, we could define that and we should talk about that. Integration really matters. So it can't just be me, the philosopher, teaching the undergraduate ethics course. It's got to be some other level of integration. Now, to what extent and how far, that's really the question, maybe a driving research and policy question for a ethics across the curriculum project. And third, support really matters. This has to be coupled, these sort of faculty-led pedagogical curricular initiatives have to be coupled to an administrative model that supports and encourages ethics across the curriculum and in a discipline. And I think, again, that landscape of sort of setting up this ideal from these three takeaways is tricky. But again, my point here is that ethics across the curriculum is used as a concept, but it's just not clearly defined, and it's not distinguished from this other thing, ethics in the discipline, in any practicable sense. Now, I saw Ali, anonymous attendee, asked this really interesting question about how can institutions effectively incentivize STEM faculty or engineering faculty to engage in EAC and EID models? Basically, why should STEM faculty care about ethics education? And this is a question, I mean, many of us, I think, are familiar with regularly. And there are really good reasons, of course, right? There's ABET accreditation reasons and literature-based reasons and empirical reasons and practical corporate level reasons, all of which suggest ethics is really important for professionalization and for employability, all of that business. But how do we incentivize faculty, especially, to sort of take up this approach? And this is part of the call that I mentioned from Nancy Matchett's work in 2008. Her suggestion is this needs to be incentivized. And I think she says something like heavily incentivized. So for instance, if we want to encourage faculty to, and this is an example from my own experience, if we want to encourage faculty to engage in a week-long summer workshop in ethics where they're going to be asked to design a, say, module that they're going to integrate in a course that next fall, we have to pay them. Otherwise, they're not going to want to go. And this circles back to the attendees' real question, which is, where does that come from? Who has money to do that? And this is why the sort of administrative support structure is so important in Matchett's model.
So at this point, I put a question into the chat box about what areas of ethics literacy frameworks and other topics or questions you have related to your engineering ethics education or other types of education. Does this more developed work around writing across the curriculum, writing within the discipline apply? And so I think that's where that anonymous attendee's question was quite accurate. How do we get the faculty to engage? We have a couple of other thoughts already started along those lines as well. So basically just asking, what are these tensions and conflicts that you're dealing with, and where could what we know with some other examples lend itself to highlighting the tensions and or maybe addressing the tensions?
Yeah, that's okay. So when we're thinking about sort of what tensions exist between this EAC and EID model, one of those we've talked about a little bit already, and that's this expertise tension. How do we balance or negotiate sort of common expertise in ethics, the sort of stuff we'd get from our personal values and our societal norms and the sort of things we bring to the table in the first place in our disciplines, our disciplinary norms, which we get from codes of ethics and acculturation practices and communities of practice within our disciplines and those things, and ethics expertise knowledge, which we might get either from a long professional experience, but also maybe from technical training in ethics, in philosophy or elsewhere. So that's one tension that I think we need to address, and it's an ongoing tension in ethics education generally. What's the role of the expert? But then there's a tension between decision-making and pedagogy. To what extent is there a link that we can identify between making effective decisions and teaching stuff in classes or workshops or modules or whatever, but teaching ethics versus like actually performing ethics, performing ethically. And I think these are all, I feel like all I'm doing is pointing to questions that I think still deserve research attention functionally or evidence. But I think those are some. And then the third one, the third tension that I think is real and we've talked through already is the ideal versus the practical. So again, circling back to Matchett's point into some of the questions we've received about incentives. If the best thing to do is to incentivize faculty to develop ethics content, ethics expertise, to have students perform workshops and to take required courses, all within an existing curricular structure, institutional model, that's a pretty big ask, right? That's an ideal. So what's the most efficient practical potential of this distinction that I'm making? And again, that's sort of an open, ongoing question.
So we have a couple of different tensions being represented in the chat, and I apologize if this is disjointed to get there. Linda discussed, I believe the best way to talk about this is the tension with top-down, bottom-up integration. So if we're looking at some very specific courses which have specific ethical implications versus what another attendee has commented in the how do we standardize without standardizing, we have those kind of tensions. I apologize for not getting this necessarily accurate, but I think this is, they're all related to one of these tensions about where do we start, knowing that there's value in both approaches. Do we have any information, or Jonathan specifically, do you have any thoughts on where do we start? What are the approaches that have happened outside of ethics education?
Yeah, part of the reason I was keen on making this distinction in the first place is that it's been made elsewhere, right? That when we think about approaches to teaching something that crosses disciplinary boundaries, we've got models ready to hand on which we could lean. So one of these is in the writing or composition studies literature and pedagogical structure. So the distinction I'm making between EAC and EID is one readily made in literature since the 1970s between WAC and WID, writing across the curriculum and writing in the disciplines. Now, disclaimer, I'm talking out of school and beyond my expertise at this point, and thanks to a community of friends and family around me who are professionals in this area. But this is a really compelling distinction or parallel, I think. When we think about the way that writing programs are structured across our institution, there are models in place at many institutions already that say every undergraduate, every first-year undergraduate student takes a writing course. And writing is integrated into disciplines in particular ways. And there are administrative structures, programs, certificates, faculty training models that are incentivized already about writing across the curriculum and writing in a discipline. These are well-established, well-institutionalized models. And I find this really compelling because there are such strong parallels, at least in my head, between what's happening in writing, our pedagogical motives, and what's happening in ethics, in our pedagogical motives. And the fact that there's such a disconnect between the administrative structures is a really interesting problem for me. And it's something that I'd like to understand better. So there are, we can talk through this if folks are interested, but in the literatures around WAC or writing across the curriculum, the same sort of distinctions are made, right? There's a distinction made, and this is from writing composition studies scholar Susan McLeod. She's making the distinction between writing to learn and learning to write in a way that we might learn, like learning about ethics and learning to ethics, right? So learning through the practice of disciplinary enculturation versus learning about ethics. And both of those things I've argued already are essential to ethical decision-making. Like, you can't just know the codes of your engineering discipline or the regulatory structures, so both Andrew Brightman and Ali are both pointing out to these regular structures or the technological constraints around ethical decision-making. You've got to make this leap that there's some other thing you need. So again, writing to learn and learning to write. I think there's a parallel that we could draw on, should draw on, and maybe are drawing on implicitly in ethics education. And again, there's lots of literature. I'll give you a couple of citations at the end here for this writing across the curriculum, writing in the disciplines distinction. But more than the literature at this point, at least in my own thinking about this, I'm intrigued by the difference, right? The thing I see as the parallel between writing and ethics at our institutions, what we think of as important sort of lifetime learning skills, things that are going to make you better in your disciplines, things that will make you better professionals down the line, and the disconnect between the administrative structures. There just doesn't seem to be the programmatic coherence or the communities of practice at a national organization level that there are in writing. And I think that's a really compelling problem for me. Joanna, I really appreciate the exclamation point and the big letters. Yeah, I also am really interested. I mean, I genuinely am interested in the parallels because I really think pedagogically from our outcomes, we're after many of the same things. And yet again, the programmatic differences are so substantial. And I think this is true across at least major research institutions, but I also think more generally. I'd love to know if you agree or disagree, but yes, and Linda, your comment is spot on. Yep, I spend a lot of time with engineering students and maybe more time with our graduate students across the university. And I think this is true that almost to the same extent, my undergraduates need and value that interdisciplinary experience and expertise across their curriculum and in their disciplines in the same way that my PhD students need them. The difference is that if we had administrative structures, we'd have more time with our undergraduate students, right? When I get my PhD students in an ethics workshop even, much less an ethics class, they're probably a year, maybe 2 years into their PhD program, already looking to sort of check the boxes, right, and to fulfill the institutional requirements and be done. And at that point, I've lost that habituation, that cultivation of literacy, I think is something that we just can't do as readily. Now, it's not true across all graduate programs and across all graduate students, but I think generally speaking, institutionalization like we have in a WAC model would be really compelling. And again, I think there are parallels here, right? There are really compelling WAC and WID initiatives focused on graduate students that just have different strategies than undergraduate programs do. So Ali, you're asking a really good question that I'm thinking about right now. You say, what areas of ethics literacy frameworks do you think are best suited for being supported with the writing studies WAC-WID findings and approaches?
Yep, and then that was the original question, but based on the comments of the chat, I flipped it around to ask instead, what are the WAC and WID initiatives that may be most readily integrated to support the challenges of ethics literature, recognizing that one may be further developed, or at least lend itself to best practices.
Yes, I will answer that, but I want to caveat it again with the disclaimer that this is not my area of expertise and I'm talking out of school. But again, as I understand it, within composition studies, within writing studies, there's still an ongoing debate about the merit and the direction of WAC approaches. So for instance, in the piece I cited you, the Susan McLeod piece, who distinguishes again between writing to learn and learning to write, this idea that we're not only teaching our students technical skills about how to write in their disciplines, but also sort of writing about writing. That distinction within WAC is a really important one. And I think there are parallels to teaching ethics there. Do we want our engineering undergraduate students to walk away knowing a 5-step ethical decision-making strategy and the code of ethics that applies in their discipline? Or do we want them understanding, like, you know, what ethics literacy is, like the ways in which reason is butting up against questions of sensitivity, and the way that motivation is linked in here, and strategies and histories within decision-making, all of that sort of meta ethics stuff, not meta ethics in a technical sense, but, you know, above the disciplinary level. And I think we do. I mean, I think that makes them better, stronger decision makers. And again, right, I'm saying this as a professional ethicist, as a philosopher. So of course I think that's true. So again, I think there's this careful balancing act, the same balancing act that's happening in composition studies or writing studies. And again, I think the fact that those two conversations aren't happening in parallel, the fact that there aren't, to my knowledge, a single instance of an EAD WID combination, right? Or a WAC-YAC combination across the country is compelling. It's a compelling issue, a compelling problem.
So I want to go back to an original question too that is in the Q&A. They're interested in knowing how to weight grades and to allocate for ethics case study exercises, to know how much to incorporate ethics. I think this actually applies to you that even beyond an individual course, with whether 5, 10, 100% of an in the discipline course should be, but the weight at which it's would be given across the discipline too.
Yeah, that's a really interesting problem. I mean, if the question, if Raghu, your question is really about, like, do grade weights accord to, in the students' minds at least, to importance of something in a course? I think that's a really compelling problem, right? If we say, if the model is, we need to integrate ethics across the curriculum, and what that means is, as it does practically for so many of us, that is at most a module in a course here and there, right? And that module is graded, 5 to 10% out of 100. It's a small piece of the otherwise packed curriculum, even in a single course. Are you indicating to your students then that ethics is only 5% important vis-a-vis everything else you're learning? Now, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, my instinct, it seems like that's an empirical question, but it seems like my intuition is, yeah, that's exactly what you're evidencing to your students, right? If ethics is just an assignment along all other assignments, they're learning some technical knowledge, some disciplinary norms, they're doing some case studies and experiments and whatever else they're doing in your disciplines. And then they're also doing this ethics thing and everything's just an assignment, then yeah, you're telling them it's only that important. And yet, imagine if they're getting that 5% in every single course they're taking, right? If ethics, again, ethics as I'm defining it is just conversations about value conflicts and how to resolve them in the most generic sense. If they're getting that conversation with consistency, every course they're taking, right? That 5% scaffolds, I think. In the same way that like you might teach your students, your engineering students, differential equations at some point, and then you're going to return to those maybe with a contextual disciplinary bent to it, but basically those same fundamentals over and over and over again. What you're doing is you're habituating them to understanding differential equations and using them. And that's exact the same thing that we're asking in WAC approaches, right? Writing across the curriculum, but ethics across curriculum approaches too. It's like that habituation of practice. They're seeing the same things, developing the same skills over and over and over again. Then I think, Raghu, the weighting of the assignment doesn't have the same effect, I would say. Again, I feel like what I'm doing is just sharing my opinions with you. So I hope what you're doing is questioning me at every turn, as you should.
There's definitely some great conversation and parallels being presented in the chat. And I think that is meant as much for the attendees as, as grilling Jonathan on a topic he's just wanting to think about and bring to our audiences of doing these parallels with some of the other approaches in literature. Specifically, I think moving back to a comment by Linda talking about teaching about plagiarism and how to cite sources with writing is different from organizing paragraphs, different from presenting specific aims for a grant, how to be succinct. So recognizing that within even both approaches, you are going to be dealing with different topics as well. And doing a wonderful job, I thought in the chat, of paralleling that with the idea of ethics. So teaching ethics codes may be different from teaching how to do ethical practice, teaching about specific ethics related to specific either disciplines or further to topics, areas.
That's great. Yes, I think that's great. And it's gotten me all excited now, because I think what we're pointing to again and again in the chat, and I think in the conversations we're having, is the fruitfulness of thinking about the relationship between, say, YAC and WAC, ethics across curriculum and writing across curriculum. The things you're talking about, the differences in writing pedagogy and content, I think are the same sorts of distinctions we make in ethics between micro and macro issues, right? There are some really technical specific issues on which we have to focus for disciplinary reasons, compliance and regulatory reasons. But then there are these much larger issues, and I think those happen both at disciplinary levels and at levels of expertise. And again, I think the fruitfulness of the comparison, thinking with another discipline about pedagogical approaches and also institutional approaches, is really important. Before I forget and or run out of time, I'm going to post right now the 4 references to 4 papers that I've leaned on in thinking about this work in the chat for you right here. Maybe 5, I can't count, 5 papers. I can also share these with Dr. Byrne, and maybe we can get them out to you in a mailing list. And I would also, I know I don't want to cut us off, but I need to say this before I forget. There's a lot of really great stuff happening in the chat and the Q&A, and I would really love to stay in touch with anybody who wants to talk this through again. We can do this informally via email, or we could set up another session, but thank you, Dr. Byrne. Yeah, I really value the conversation, and I'm glad we've gotten such a good group of questions going here. Ali, are there other things we should be thinking about that you've seen?
There's a kind of a hot topic about recognizing that undergrads have much less experience with real world that I think is pretty fantastic and similar to some of the work that you and I talk about. I don't know if we have too much time with that, but I want to appreciate that approach. I also want to just encourage the audience to continue to think about the different ways, not only the writing across the curriculum in the discipline distinctions could help lend itself to the topic of incorporating ethics education, but also other areas. So I think that's the profound thing about your talk and discussion today was you're saying there's knowledge over here. Let's see what it can lend itself as we address problems within ethics education. So I guess my final question to the chat is, sorry, I'm reading some more too, is there anything else you've been thinking about or that you're now thinking about? How can this lend itself to my my tensions or questions or considerations with my own ethics education approaches. And or the opposite again, if you're approaching writing across the curriculum, how is this ethics conversation address that?
Yeah, thanks. I think, I mean, perhaps this is quite self-serving for the community at least, but one of the reasons I think the one reason I think there's such fruitful comparisons to be made between these two programs is that ethics education has a pretty steep hill to climb in arguing for itself within our institutions. And I think one way to do that is to say, look, there are these really compelling parallels between what's happening in writing and composition studies and what's happening in ethics. And you've got these already existing institutional, even national level organizational structures to support this work, including incentives, including centers and top level administrative approaches and support. There's a strategy by which ethics education can argue for its place at the table. And I think in combination with what's happening in our professions, namely a greater and greater societal call reflected in our professions and our corporations for a focus on ethics, combined with this largely technologically driven social concern about ethics right now, I think there's a really compelling, it's a timeliness to making this argument that ethics education should have a much more prominent place at the table institutionally. Now, again, that's not to say that it doesn't at many institutions already. And it's not to say that most institutions don't want to support ethics and don't see it as important. It's just a question of how that should happen. And Ali, you got me reading and thinking in the chat too. And the only thing I would say about the undergraduate question is that is maybe about circling back to Cindy and Linda's comments recently. And that is, I think the thing we can't forget is that every one of us bring values to the table when we're making decisions, including our undergraduates. And they might be bringing values to the table that maybe aren't based on 20 years of professional experience or even 5 years, but they're still bringing values to the table. And the more explicit we can make those and the more clear we can make the conflicts that they face between their own personal values and their institutional values, for instance, the better it is for them. And the longer they can make those connections across a curriculum, the stronger that sense of ethics literacy is going to be. So again, yet another argument for this ethics across curriculum distinction, combined with, I think, this ethics in the discipline emphasis.
I am here because we are 1 minute from the top of the hour, and I'm feeling, just watching the chat, watching the Q&A, listening, that we have just begun and that there's a lot of, I guess, significantly more questions that need to be answered. And I want to put out there the possibility of a part 2, because I think you've just begun to stir the pot of some really important questions that are worth further explanation. But today has been an incredible, provocative start to this conversation. And I thank you both very much. Jonathan, thank you. Ali, thank you. And for all of you who are here with us today, please join the Longline Ethics Center. Please come back. We're going to have another, another of these in the series will come up next month. We'll be looking at, Dr. Steve Starrett and Dr. Carlos Bertha will be talking with us about the changes to the Code for Civil Engineers and what that means for teaching ethics. So thank you all, and come to the center. We're talking about setting up communities of practice. Maybe we need to have one specifically around this ethics across, or whichever distinction we want to go with, the curriculum. Thank you again. All the best to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. This was fun.
Thank you.